With 20 jacks in 8 HP, there's a lot going on in Cold Mac, and none of it is immediately obvious. This video is not a review and is in no way comprehensive or exhaustive. Simply, the aim is to provide rudimentary visual and audio examples of the individual functional components of Cold Mac in support of the existing written documentation and other demo videos that are available for this module. The hope is that by demonstrating each bit of circuitry on its own, you can more easily internalize what makes up the module and how it behaves. So if we are successful, the documentation should make a lot more sense. This video grew out of my own unofficial alternative manual for Cold Mac, which you can read at the URL shown here and in the video description below. Let's start at the top with the survey knob and its input jack. The input jack accepts either audio or CV, and like most things in Cold Mac, it's bipolar and designed to work with either AC or DC. This is merely an offset generator, and the range of the knob is 5 volts to negative 5 volts. Now, there is no direct output for survey on the panel. The closest I know of to get to that is to take the left out with nothing else patched here. So if I put that into the scope, you'll see when I turn this up, we're at about 5 volts. It's a little bit under according to data. If I go in the opposite direction, we're at negative 5 volts. If I bring in, say, in this case, a sine wave LFO, plug it into the input, you'll see the sine wave represented there on the scope. If I add voltage, you'll see I've offset the sine wave in the positive direction. In fact, it appears to be getting clipped. Now, that clipping may be happening because of this left circuit. We can't tell because we don't have a direct output. If I go in the opposite direction, I've offset my sine wave down into the negative voltage domain. I could also be putting an audio signal into this for audio rate modulation purposes. Now, the actual voltage range here appears to be a little bit larger than 5 volts to negative 5 volts. If I say bring in a high voltage, so this is coming from maths, if I pump 10 volts into it, you'll see we're actually topping out at 6.14 volts. And if I go in the opposite direction and I pump in a negative 10 volts, we're still at negative 5 volts. So perhaps the range is something like negative 5 volts to 6 volts, but again, this left circuit and however it operates may be affecting what we're seeing on the scope. Now, why do we care about the survey knob? Well, the survey knob is primarily here to provide a voltage source by default to all of these utility circuits. And it does do that. And if you look at the panel, several of the jacks have a little hexagon next to them with the letter S in them. So all of these do. And there's also some additional normalization that's represented by some of the arrows. So in effect, every circuit in Cold Mac does receive an offset from survey by default. As soon as you start putting other cables into these jacks that have those little S's on them, that breaks the normal and disconnects them and the entire circuit that they are part of from survey. We'll be returning to survey over and over in the upcoming sections of this video. The first two complete rows of jacks comprise the crossfading circuit in Cold Mac. Now, the panel graphics are a bit misleading. These lines imply that there's a left circuit with a left input that has a fade jack and an output, and then a right circuit that has a right input, an offset jack, and an output. But in actuality, these two rows all comprise one circuit, and the fade and offset jacks affect the entire circuit, both left and right, at the same time. The crossfading circuit works equally well with CV or audio, but we're going to start with audio. I'll start by taking an audio signal from our oscillator and putting it into the left input. And I'm going to take the left output and the right output into our scope, and so that we can hear them, the left and right outputs from there. Now, just using the knob, we can easily pan our audio signal between the left and right channels. And if you're on headphones or listening to this on stereo speakers, you should be able to hear our sound source pan from one side to the other. Now, the reason that this is working is that the fade jack right here is normaled to our knob. So if I say take an LFO, sine wave LFO, and plug it into fade, I can automate that panning capability. I'm just slowing down the LFO here. And as soon as I've patched into fade, I've broken the normal, so the knob here no longer has any effect. Now, of course, I could instead have patched my LFO into the survey jack, which would achieve much the same thing, because fade is now inheriting the value of survey, and I'm setting survey with my LFO. In addition, I can use in this configuration my knob to add positive or negative offset. So now the entire panning behavior is favoring the right channel because I've added some positive offset. If I add some negative offset, it'll favor the left channel and be weighted towards the left. If I keep going, may even hear a little bit of distortion in there. Yep. Now, while I'm here, I can also add another sound source into the right input. So I'll just take this other oscillator and add it to right. Now we could cross pan both sound sources. So whatever is in left will either come out of left or right depending on my fade setting, which in this case is still being handled by survey. You can hear the two different oscillators switching position between left and right in this patch. While I'm here, let's talk about the offset. Offset is merely an insertion point. So you can add an additional signal into offset, and that signal will be added equally to both the left and right outputs. I'll choose a different one here. There, can hear it better. So now, no matter what my survey setting is, or for that matter, whatever I'm putting into fade, I'll bring back our sine wave LFO. We have two oscillators that are cross panning between left and right, plus there's a third oscillator that is being inserted that's sitting right in the middle of the mix because it's being added equally to left and right. I'll pull it back out so you can hear the first two oscillators by themselves switching positions, and here's our offset right in the middle. That is all that offset does. It simply allows you to add a voltage that is then equally distributed to both the left and right outputs. In this next patch, we still have two different sound sources patched into the left and right inputs, but we're only taking one output. This output is going to the scope and then this on to be heard in our audio stream. In this configuration, I've created a crossfader. So we can simply fade between two different inputs and hear the result in the output. And again, this works great with both audio or CV. In addition, you can employ audio rate modulation here as in almost anywhere else in Cold Mac. So if I choose a modulator and run it up into audio rates, you can use the crossfader to create new timbres with audio rate modulation. Next, let's look at the crossfade circuit and how it behaves unpatched. I'm simply going to take the left out into my oscilloscope. You'll see at the moment we see 0 volts. I'm going to adjust survey. So I raise survey, turning it clockwise. You're going to see the voltage value rise on the oscilloscope and come to a rest at 5 volts. We've already seen this earlier when we were just discussing the survey knob. If I turn it in the other direction, it drops to -5 volts. But again, all we're doing with this knob actually is we are providing a CV value for the fade jack. So there's nothing in our left or right inputs. So why are we seeing anything on the scope at all? Well, the reason we are is that the left jack is normaled to a -5 volts, and the right jack is normaled to a +5 volts. And if you look really carefully at the panel, you'll see little graphics there to remind you of this. There's a plus in a little circle next to the right jack, and there's a minus in a circle next to the left jack. So what we're actually doing by modulating this survey knob is we're crossfading between -5 volts and +5 volts. And the end result of that is that the left output is providing us a fluctuating value that mirrors our movement of the survey knob. If I switch to the right output, it's going to do the exact opposite, because we're now crossfading between 5 volts and -5 volts as opposed to -5 volts crossfading with 5 volts. So it provides the equal but opposite result. If I plug them both in, we can see them converge and diverge symmetrically around 0. If we look at our panel graphics, we'll see the little icons next to the outputs. The icons are representing this behavior that we're witnessing with the oscilloscope. Next to the left output, we see a line that rises from -5 volts up to +5 volts, which is exactly what we see when we sweep, starting at the counterclockwise position, and we go all the way to the clockwise position. Right is exactly the opposite. You see it starting high and ending low, which again is what we see when we start fully counterclockwise. We're at 5 volts, which is what right is normal to. And as we turn it, we go down to -5 volts, which is what left is normal to, because we've crossfaded this output from right to left. Because these are normals, we can break them. So for example, at the moment, I have crossfaded the left input to the right output. But if I insert a dummy cable in the left input, you'll see that the right output has just snapped back to around 0 volts, because it's no longer receiving any real value in left. It's actually crossfaded to essentially 0. Similarly, if we break the normal in the right jack, you're going to see it snap back to 0 volts because there's no more 5-volt signal that is being sent through the circuit. I've broken the normal. But if I turn this knob, you're going to see the value go down to -5 volts because I've now just crossfaded to the -5 volts that are present in this left jack. We've talked about how left is normal to -5 volts and right is normal to +5 volts, and how we can use fade to crossfade these two voltages between the left and right outputs. We can use this information in order to wring a voltage inverter out of cold Mac. For example, if I take a sine wave LFO, we'll put that into the scope so we can see it, and then I patch that signal into fade, I can take the right output, because the right channel is going to crossfade the opposite way of the left channel, and plug that into the scope, and you'll see with the blue trace we're getting a perfect inverted version of our input signal. Now I could also have patched into survey instead of into fade and achieved much the same thing. However, because I'm patched into survey, that means I can also add and remove offset using the survey knob. So if I turn the survey knob clockwise, we see we push our new waveform further into the negative voltage domain, and it's even getting clipped off. If I go the other direction, we can pull it up into the positive voltage domain, and it also similarly is distorted. The next functional block we're going to examine for cold Mac is the analog logic. Analog logic comprises the OR row and the AND row, and unlike the crossfader circuit, these are completely separate, but we're going to discuss them together because they're complementary. We use nomenclature of OR1, OR2, and OR out, AND1, AND2, and AND out because there's some redundancy in the way they're labeled on the graphics. So if we bring in a signal into the OR circuit and patch this on to the scope, we can see we've got a sine wave LFO. Now, analog logic is about comparing two different signals, so I need to get a second signal here into the second input. What I'm going to do is bring in a different LFO into the OR2 input. Now you're going to see there's a combined result. The second signal is a faster square wave LFO, and you can see it being expressed wherever it is higher in value than the sine wave that's coming into the first input. And that's the nature of analog OR logic. Whichever has the highest signal between the two inputs wins. By contrast, AND is the opposite. It's whichever signal is lower wins. So now we still have our sine wave coming into the input, and it's still in the OR input, but because the AND input is normal to OR1, we're getting a copy of our sine wave here. And I've moved my second signal into AND2, and we're looking at the AND output. It's a similar result in that we still see both waves combined, but now the lowest value is the one that wins. So we're seeing the square wave LFO expressed beneath the sine wave whenever the sine wave is higher in value of voltage to whatever the square wave is doing. Now, if I remove our square wave, you see at the moment the sine wave is just gone. Now, why is that? Well, we no longer have anything going into the AND2 input, but AND2 is normaled to the survey knob. The survey knob is currently at -5 volts. The sine wave is oscillating between -5 volts and +5 volts, which means that the comparison is between whatever the sine wave is doing and -5 volts. The lowest voltage level wins in an AND comparison, and so we're just sitting here at -5 volts. If I start raising that voltage, you'll see that I'm beginning to allow the sine wave to express itself at any point beneath the threshold that I've set with the survey knob. If I turn survey all the way up, now survey is at 5 volts, and we're comparing whatever the sine wave is doing to that static 5 volts. In this case, the sine wave is always at or below 5 volts, and therefore in the AND comparison, we get to see the full sine wave. Now, interestingly, if I set survey to 0, we now have achieved what's called half-wave rectification, or partial rectification of the signal. We have sliced the signal so that in this case we're seeing only the half of the signal that is beneath 0 volts. If I switch back to the OR output, we've got similarly the half-wave rectification that's showing us only the positive portion of our signal. I can put these both on screen by connecting this thusly, and now you see in blue the negative portion of our sine wave, and in green the positive portion. Let's take a moment to look at what happens with this circuit when no signal at all is patched here. So both the OR2 and the AND2 jack are normaled to our survey offset. We have no signal at all present in OR and AND, which means that they are effectively 0 volts. As I adjust survey to the left counterclockwise all the way to -5 volts, we see that the AND circuit value has dropped to -5 volts. So as I turn up to 0, they're both at 0. And as I turn clockwise to 5 volts, we see that the OR value has climbed to 5 volts. However, the AND value has stayed at 0. If you think about it, we still have active comparisons going on here. I'm at 5 volts. So in the OR circuit, whichever is the highest voltage level wins. We are effectively comparing 0 volts to 5 volts. 5 volts wins, 5 volts is what we see here. On the AND circuit, we're comparing 0 volts to 5 volts. Lowest value wins. So consequently, our AND trace is showing us that our output is actually 0 volts because 0 volts is lower than 5 volts. If we look at the panel graphics, we see the little icon next to our outputs are indicating exactly this behavior. The icon next to the OR output shows that you have a flat 0 volt response for anything that is below 0 volts and the sweep of survey, and then it starts to rise because the voltage in survey wins the comparison against 0 volts. And you see the exact opposite. At -5 volts, the voltage is winning the comparison against 0 volts out of the AND circuit, and therefore it climbs all the way up to 0 volts, and then it stops because from then on, when survey is at 0 or higher, then 0 volts is winning the comparison. Just like we used the OR logic to create a new wave shape out of 2 LFOs, we can use the same logic to create new timbres with audio signals. In this case, I have a simple waveform coming from this oscillator, and I'm going to add a second waveform from a separate oscillator. And you see we get a combined result out of the OR output. Further changes to the source material give us new timbre options. Moreover, just as we saw earlier, I can use the normalization of survey into our comparison to slice up an incoming audio signal. It gives you a subtle, buzzier sort of timbral effect in this case because we're introducing some discontinuity into this otherwise fairly straightforward cycling waveform. In this patch we have two different signals running into AND and OR. We're taking the outputs separately into a mixer and mixing them back together again. Nothing is patched into either OR2 or AND2, which means that we have control over each with the survey knob. By adjusting that, we can essentially crossfade between the two of them, but we're doing so with logic. In the Cold Mac documentation, Whimsical Raps calls this logical mixing. And it's a crossfade, but it's a buzzier one because of those discontinuities that we're introducing by slicing each of the incoming audio signals and generating a crossover point there. Next, we're going to talk about the slope circuit. That's these three jacks that begin with slope, follow, and then what we call the slope output. Here we have our trusty sine wave LFO. I'm going to patch that into the slope input. Now, all that the slope circuit is a full wave rectifier. So when I take the output of this into the scope, we're going to see that we still have our sine wave, but all of the negative voltage has been inverted into the positive voltage domain. If we simplify what we're looking at here, this is the full wave rectification of our sine wave. In this patch, I have a sine wave coming from this oscillator, and I'm multing it once into the slope input and also into the left input of Cold Mac. I'm taking the slope output, the full wave rectification version of my sine wave, into the right input, and I'm using the crossfader to move between them. So at this end we have our untouched sine wave, and at this other extreme we have our fully rectified version of it, which you can hear is an octave higher and is a little buzzier because of the discontinuities that we have introduced at the zero crossing. Those discontinuities add extra harmonic content, and that's one of the side effects of full wave rectification with audio signals. If we look at the slope circuit unpatched, just take its output. What we're actually running through slope is survey, because slope is normal to survey. And all we're doing here is we're passing this voltage through a full wave rectifier. So at zero, it's zero. At 5 volts, you'll see it's 5 volts. And at negative 5 volts, the output of the rectifier is positive 5 volts. So through the sweep of survey, the voltage starts out high. Then as you approach noon, it drops to 0. And then as you continue clockwise, it climbs again to 5 volts. And that is indeed what we see with the little icon that accompanies the output jack for slope. Now there's an additional output in this circuit which is called follow. All follow does is it takes whatever the output voltage of the full wave rectifier is, and it applies a modest slewing. Let's take a look at what that does by observing both outputs simultaneously. So in green we have the rectified voltage from survey. In blue, we're going to have the slewed rectified voltage from survey. They're very similar. The main difference is that with the simply rectified signal, you're going to see more sharp corners and discontinuities, and the follow signal is going to lag slightly behind because it's slewed. And you can see that in the output on data. Now, follow is an example of the rare feature in cold Mac that will not pass audio. There's too much slewing taking place in this circuit. So if you put an audio signal into slope, you're not going to get anything useful out of follow. The full rectified output of just the slope circuit is fine for audio, but the follow output really only applies to CV. The slewing circuit has no actual extra controls associated with it. So you have no ability to adjust the rise and fall rates or the glide amount of this. It's a fixed slewing rate. But it does give you a slightly smoother version of whatever you're putting into slope, or as likely as not, the value of survey that slope is normal to. So our last full row of jacks in cold Mac is the Crease circuit, and it's one input with two different outputs, and these are two of the most unusual features in cold Mac. Let's start by looking at the Crease input and Crease output. I'm going to bring back our trusty sine wave LFO here, and I'm going to patch that into the Crease input, and then I'm going to patch the Crease output into the oscilloscope, and blue trace is the result of passing the sine wave through Crease. And it's kind of interesting. So I've never seen a circuit like this. In effect, what it has done is it's taken the positive part of the signal. In the case of the sine wave, it's the hump, and it's translated it from the positive voltage domain below 0 volts into the negative voltage domain. And it's taken the negative part of the sine wave, the trough of the sine wave, and it's translated that above 0 into the positive voltage domain. And in the process, wherever there's a 0 crossing, it's introduced a huge discontinuity, a leap from either 5 volts to negative 5 volts or negative 5 volts to 5 volts, and that's where those vertical lines are coming in. And that's literally what the Crease circuit does with any signal you put in it. If you run audio through the Crease circuit, what you're going to get is a mangled version of that audio signal with potentially some significant discontinuities added, so it'll be very buzzy. Let's look at the Crease circuit unpatched. I'll take the output of Crease directly into the scope, and now we are simply looking at survey through the Crease circuit, because the Crease input is normal to the slope input, and the slope input is normal to survey. So as long as we don't have anything in either of these jacks, survey is the voltage that's being sent to Crease. And as I adjust the survey knob, you'll see the voltage behaving in a way that's recognizably similar to what we were seeing with the sine wave LFO. So with survey fully counterclockwise at negative 5 volts, the Crease is giving us 0 volts. And as I turn that clockwise towards 0, the voltage rises until I hit 0. Then it suddenly plummets at 0 volts down to negative 5 volts. And as I continue to turn it clockwise, the voltage rises again back to 0. Going back the other direction, the voltage falls down towards negative 5 volts. And once I hit 0 volts at survey, it pops back up to 5 volts. As I keep turning counterclockwise to negative 5 volts, we return to 0. If we look at the panel, the graphic icon next to the output is somewhat reminiscent of this behavior that we're seeing on the oscilloscope from manipulating the survey knob from fully counterclockwise to counterclockwise. This brings us to the location jack. The location circuit is a completely different circuit from the Crease circuit as far as I can tell, but it does inherit its input from the Crease jack. So by default, location is responsive to whatever survey is doing. Let's take a look at it. I'm just going to take the direct out from location into the scope. And at the moment, survey is at noon or 0 volts. Location acts a little bit like a car or a boat in terms of something that you steer. So if you think of the survey knob as being a little like a steering wheel, if you turn survey a little bit, the voltage starts to climb from location. And it climbs a certain amount, and it does so fairly slowly, and then it stops. If I turn the other direction, the voltage starts to fall, and it keeps falling for a while. And in this case, it will keep going below 0 volts down to whatever it ends up winding up at, and then it grinds to a halt and stops. Just like a car or boat, if you turn your steering wheel or tiller much further, then you will turn the vehicle faster. And in this case, you'll also affect how quickly the voltage of location rises or falls. So now I'm going to flip this all the way clockwise, and you're going to see the voltage rise much faster as it goes up to its maximum value. Similarly, if I go the opposite direction all the way, that's as fast as location will move when it is stimulated by survey. In general, when you move survey to 0, then the voltage stops changing at location. In reality, it doesn't necessarily stop, but it will drift to a stop sooner or later. Now, one thing I have found is that I can push the location circuit further by using a voltage source that is higher voltage than the survey knob can produce. This is, again, remember, is 5 volts to negative 5 volts. I'm going to bring in a hotter signal from maths. So this I'm going to put into Crease, and I'm going to raise this up to 10 volts. So I'm putting positive 10 volts here into Crease. And the location has climbed fairly quickly up to its maximum value. And I'm going to show you what happens when I drop this input voltage now to negative 10 volts. Mainly, you're going to see it is going to move much faster down to its minimum than it did when it was only being given a 5 volt offset. So here we go. So that's a pretty steep, pretty rapid decline. The main takeaway is that if you want the location to move faster than you're able to get it to do with survey alone, try using a higher voltage signal into the Crease output. Lastly, we're going to look at the Mac output. In addition to all of the stuff that's going on that we've already looked at in Cold Mac, there's an additional layer wherein these 6 inputs are also being summed together passed through a VCA that's controlled by survey and output from Mac. Now, this whole extra layer is for audio only. It will not pass control voltage. Let's just see this in action. Here's a bit of audio, and I'm going to pass the Mac output into our scope, which we can listen to. I have survey turned all the way down, so we're hearing nothing. I'll turn it up. Looks like we're getting a sine wave there, which I'll make into a bit more of a ramp. And let's add some more. And some more. And how about some more? It's actually starting to distort quite a bit. If I back off on this, we can get rid of pretty much all of the distortion. But it's a simple sum of all of these audio signals, and then under the control of survey. Now, of course, I can put CV into here and let CV control survey instead. So for instance, this is a repeating envelope from maths. That behaves pretty much as you'd expect. There's one more feature of the Mac output that we need to examine, and that is that during the summing stage, when these 6 inputs are summed, whatever you plug into OR or slope will receive 2 times the gain of the other inputs. To illustrate, here I'm plugging in a sine wave from Just Friends into the left input, and we have what we would expect from 5 volts to -5 volts, a sine wave. If, however, I unplug from left and plug into OR, you see we're now getting a 20 volt point to point, 10 volts to -10 volts approximately sine wave, because this has received twice the gain. Now this extra gain has to do with the normaling between and OR and between the crease and slope inputs. If I plug into and, you'll see I have regular gain. If I plug into slope, you see I have twice as much. If I plug into crease, I'm back to regular gain again. So if I'm in OR and I'm receiving twice the gain, and I break this normal by putting a dummy cable into and, it removes the extra gain. Basically, the takeaway is that if you want to subtly amplify an audio signal, you can do so by running into cold Mac, into the OR input, or into the slope input, and as long as you don't break the normals, you'll get twice the gain out of Mac. One other detail that you need to be aware of: this whole multi-layer system is cute in cold Mac, but it doesn't mean that you can mix CV and audio with impunity and still do this summing business with the Mac output. For example, I'm going to bring in a square wave from a low frequency oscillator, and you should be able to hear the popping sound. While the Mac output will not pass CV, that doesn't mean that CV can't pollute the summing stage that feeds the Mac output.